Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel, and today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week, these little ones here. And it's been, again, a fun reading week, even though, again, I think various parts of the year I feel like my brain has been slightly broken when it comes to reading. Well, I'll have these moments of really being able to concentrate and then not at all. But these books have been lovely company, so let's talk a little bit about them. First up, a really quiet little gem of a book, and it's a very short book. This is The Party by Tessa Hadley. And I hadn't read anything by her before, but she's an author whose name I always see around, that she's been writing for a while, I think, and has had a fair few books out that have been very much loved. So yeah, really great to finally read something by her. And this book is largely about two characters, these two sisters who have this interesting shared life just in sort of post-war England. And they are, in many ways, the very much a product of that time. They are these new upwardly mobile women who are sort of ready to take on the world, ready to step into what's now changed, a world where for much of World War II women had been able to work, and so there's a slightly different change of sort of feeling in the air, and these two women are ready to go and conquer things. But we realise quite quickly into this book how much they're still very much subject to the social pressures and mores of the world around them. And particularly, I think what's interesting for these two women is how it then relates to their sexuality in a broader sense. So they are invited to a party, hence the title. And the two women have in many ways, a very similar but also very different experience of this party. And I don't want to spoil anything around that. But these two women come to try to understand what is being expected of them and what that looks like, and particularly where it comes to their sexuality and the idea of them being sexual beings. That seems to be something that is both hinted at very heavily by the world around them, but is also something that is locked away from them to some degree. And so I find this really interesting as a book, particularly for the very subtle ways that it shifts across the book. Like I said, it's about 100 pages long, and it feels quite slow moving at first, where you can't quite work out what's happening. But I found the observations of the glances between characters, or the way they interact with each other, really fascinating. And particularly when it comes to the end, where we are given some essentially bombshell news, and yet the characters have to navigate that in an entirely new way, in a very quiet, self-preserved way where only they can talk to each other about it. And so I found this really quietly powerful. I thought it was a beautiful little book. So in many ways, a book with very similar themes. Levitation for Beginners by Suzannah Dunn. And again, another author with many books under her belt who I've not read before. And this I thought was really interesting in a similar way because like The Party, a large part of this book is talking about coming of age. And this is in a slightly different time period. This is, I think, the 70s, going into the 70s. And so we have lots of references to foods or TV ads or whatever else happening at the time. And this is very, very rooted in that time and in an England that was essentially just before me. I was born in the late 80s, but there are many things here where, these are things that would have been quite big for sort of a few generations before me. And so these references are things that I would have seen maybe on television as remnants of this time. So it felt very, very rooted to that sense of England in the 70s, and particularly to these two characters who I think were this sort of family that was really interesting for different reasons. The way this book deals with coming of age is one that is fraught with a lot of confusion and fear and anxiety, and particularly, again, like with The Party, related to sex and sexuality in some ways. The idea of the first blooms of who you might want to date or anything like that. But I think the book also does some really fascinating things in the background around how somebody who might stand out massively in a place and time like this would then go on to develop in other ways. And so Deborah, our main character, who we're told is very much not a Debbie, her mother is Scottish and is very insistent on a specific pronunciation. And so we get this really very interesting flashback into a time in England where certain things were happening and certain people and places looked a certain way, but also where the relationships are so related to that time and place. So characters will not feel like they're able to be or do their full variety of what's interesting to them because of this time. They're almost born into wrong eras. So I found this really interesting and beautiful as well, including just very funny and silly in points as well. And now for something entirely different, Stag Dance by Torrey Peters. And I really loved her first book, Detransition Baby, which I thought was really funny, full of this wisecracking kind of humor, this thing where it was both very sarcastic and sardonic and almost attached, but also very much of the world and generous with its characters whilst also pointing out their many faults. And in many ways, Stag Dance does a lot of similar things. So Stag Dance looks a lot at particularly experiences with gender across 4 novellas as it's billed. One of them is longer than the others, so Stag Dance is the main one at a bit over 100 pages, and the other 3 novellas fit into the rest of this book at roughly about 50 pages each. And I found it a really interesting collection of these novellas or stories. At first, I wasn't sure how they necessarily hung together, and at one point the key theme seemed to just be pigs, which seemed to appear in 3 of the 4. But it breaks up this idea of what it might look like to explore gender in various different ways. So our first novella is all about the idea of this dystopia or kind of Mad Max future, but where essentially everybody has caught some kind of contagion, which means that they don't naturally develop hormones. And so essentially you have to take hormones for any gender presentation. And that sort of also has in the background this love story and this kind of odd thing. I found it really fascinating. We then have another story that is particularly about 2 young boys at school who have a sort of thing going, and there's a lot of violence but a lot of humor and joy as well in it. But that story is about who really has the power between someone who passes as the traditional typical boy who's maybe more masculine, or someone who's more of an effeminate boy but who is able to wield that also as a weapon in their own way. And then we have Stag Dance, the central novella, which is about essentially a set of folk rituals almost that are to do with gender and sexuality, but almost this kind of lumberjack style thing, but also set sort of in the 1800s, early 1900s. And that has all of these hallmarks of what masculinity might be, but are also playing with that idea of, you know, what is an authentic expression of masculinity or gender if all of these other things are taken away from them. And in the final story, we have particularly a look at feminizing behaviors within essentially fetish and sexuality, of if there is a sexual fetish around feminizing someone, how does that play out in other sets of gender and sexuality, and the language that we use around that? How does that impact people who are involved in it if what they are doing is both a role play but also potentially part of who they are? As you can tell, this book is a lot between those 4 novellas or 4 parts, but I think it's really interesting in the way that it explores them, because I think Torrey Peters is a smart enough writer to make sure that there are these interesting ways that this is happening. It's all very nuanced at times, but other times, you know, hitting you with a blunt hammer. And I think the way she's able to weave together these really intelligent and important points with something bombastic, something funny, something sarcastic, often quite sexy, but also really disturbing. There's a lot going on in this, but I really enjoyed it. And I thought that it just again proves to me just how whip smart she is as a writer, to be able to go to the limits with some of these ideas and then just keep pushing a little bit further and seeing what happens. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think Detransition Baby felt more like a complete work for me personally, because that is just, you know, a novel with a central idea. But it's interesting to note with these 4 novellas that they were written at different times. They also span 4 different genres, basically. So this feels in many ways like a compendium or almost of her thoughts on these topics, but put into one place in this really fascinating way. So I really greatly enjoyed this, and it's a book that I really want to stop and think a little bit more about afterwards as well, because of how much is going on within this and the points that it raises about gender, often about transness, but through the eyes of non-trans characters, or non-explicitly named trans characters. And so I thought that was really interesting within this book. And last but not least, we have Private Revolutions by Yuan, and this is a book that was on the non-fiction shortlist for the Women's Prize this year, and it tells the story of China, well, sort of modern day China, through the eyes of 4 women, and it does so in a really fascinating way. I think it's quite panoramic almost, that we will be introduced to a character, we'll shift over here to somebody else, we'll look out at the sweeping history of China to give context, but then also come back and look more at the modern day and look at more modern iterations of what she's talking about. And a lot comes up in this book, particularly around education and politics and the ability to define yourself, or to go against the grain in some ways. So this book looks at contextual history to point out the ways that, for example, women in China may have been told, for example, here is a specific way of how you have to behave, and then how these 4 women are in many ways going along with that, but also going against that. So, for example, one woman who is working as a tutor and works in a tutoring company at one point, but takes on a different educational philosophy to the one that is set out in Chinese schools, and what that looks like. And also other people in this book who are speaking out about what's happening to them, or are changing up things, or are in many ways caught by parts of their history. So the book frequently references the hukou, which are these essentially certificates of which province or town or area you sort of belong to according to the state. So that is often where you're born, but this book exposes how, for many people, the hukou become these really complicated things, because if you've got one for Beijing or Shenzhen or Shanghai or any of the really big cities, you're sorted. You've got a really great set of access to some of the best resources perhaps, but if you are in a more rural province or area, perhaps you don't have that same luxury. And so there are people who work really hard to avoid some of those difficulties, or to move to a new place and to re-establish themselves, but are still caught in the various parts of their hukou for where they are now. And so I thought the book did a really great job of exploring that. I will say, sort of at times, I did feel almost that the book, because we change characters quite quickly, sometimes I got a little bit confused about who each person was. But I also think the book did a really good job often at restating where we were with each person to bring us up to speed, and actually to really look at the commonalities for some of these women and where their lives and their personal situations overlapped quite a lot. So I thought this was a really interesting book, and I see why this is on the shortlist, because I think this is quite an exciting look into particularly modern day China, which I think often when China is written about at the moment, it's either written about only exclusively, I think, well, not exclusively, but often written about more from the perspective of its history, or as an economic superpower currently. And I think it often misses that personal story of people who are in the modern day, but who are affected by this long sweep of history as well. So I thought it was a fascinating book in many ways, and I am intrigued to read a bit more around the subject based on this as well. So those are the books that I've been reading this week. I hope you're having a great week, and I will speak to you all soon. Take care and have a really good week.